Okay, so you've given us the tawny owl. I'm going to give you a barn owl, because we've seen plenty of the barn owl over the spring when we saw it nesting. And we're seeing it in the daytime here. These shots were from this afternoon. Look how absolutely gorgeous that barn owl looks. It's out in the day. Watch this flight. They've got big wings in comparison to their body, and they don't flap so much as glide. Look at that. They're silent ambush hunters. So when they're flying, they don't make a noise. It plunges down and it comes up with a prey, no doubt something like a vole. So we know that it has silent flight. But what is it about those wings and the feathers that makes its flight silent?
Well, I'm very pleased to say that after years of talking about these birds' feathers and the way that they allow them to fly silently, we've spoken to Ignacio Maria Viola, Professor of Fluid Mechanics and Bio-Inspired Engineering at the University of Edinburgh, and Josh Lanham, who's taking a PhD in Physical Oceanography at Cambridge University. And why have we spoken to these people who are essentially physicists when it comes to a biological matter? Well, because the way that these birds are able to fly silently comes down to the physics more than the biology in some ways. Let's take a look at the feathers. You mentioned that, Michaela. So here we've got a tawny owl feather. I've got a bit of black card here, which is going to make them a bit more visible. There we go. So here's our tawny owl feather, and you can see the characteristic colouring of that. It's camouflage so that during the day it can't be found by all those annoying small birds that will mob it. And here we have a barn owl feather. And again, you can recognise that as very clearly a feather that's coming from that species due to the colouring. But what I'd like you to do is to look at the top edge of that feather running along here. You'll see, if you look really carefully there, that it looks fluffy. There's a comb running along that edge. It's not a clean edge at all. And in fact, if I turn it like that, you can see also that it's matte in colour. It's not shiny, and that it's very velvety. Let's take a closer look at that, because we've had it underneath our microscope. There is that fringed edge that runs along the edge of the feather, and this is characteristic of these species. We don't see this in a lot of other species, and we see it on the principal flight feathers of our owls, tawny and barn owls. How, however, does that make the flight silent? What asset to that is the... where's my Sharpie? Here we are. Well, here is a diagram that shows that. So let's imagine that each of these protrusions here are one of those barbs on the leading edge of the feather. Well, these act as streamwise vortex generators. What does that mean? Well, it means that as the feather's being pushed down through the air, it generates a tiny swirling vortex of air, about the diameter of the distance between them, which runs down over the top of the feather like that. And because it's swirling so tightly, I mean, it's pretty small when you think about it, probably just under a millimetre, it's sticking to the surface of the feather. And that is part of the key. Michaela, you've got another prop there. Now, let's look at the wing here. So here's the edge with the comb running down. And what happens when these streamwise vortex generators are in action is that these vortices come down here, and it prevents the laminar disruption of flow, and it keeps the air really close to the top of the owl's wing. What happens if you have a wing without these, and we've shaved in an imaginary sense all of those combs off of that? What happens here is that a vortices would generate, but then it would flick off into the air here. It wouldn't stick to the surface of the owl's wing. It would radiate out. And I have to tell you, it's this which makes the noise. So keeping the air close to the surface of the feather and the wing is what makes it quiet.
Isn't that amazing, eh? It really is such a fascinating thing. And it works brilliantly for silent flight if the feathers are dry. It's not so efficient if these feathers are wet. And if you look at this, you can see what happens to them when they're wet. They get flat and they stick together. So what Chris was explaining, how it works, is it doesn't work so well with getting them to have silent flight when they're wet. And it's actually nothing to do with the fact that they're not waterproof, which is what we used to think, is it? It's more the fact, as I say, that just that whole system doesn't work if these bits get wet, which is really fascinating.
Exactly, they sort of basically get clogged up by the water. I mean, the owls have a europygial gland, a preen gland, full of that oil which keeps their feathers waterproof, just like any other bird. But of course, because it's matte and velvety, it's more absorbent. It just soaks up the water.
And so when they do get wet and they haven't got silent flight anymore, that really affects their ability to hunt, particularly barn owls. Why? Well, it's because barn owls tend to hunt at night. They prefer to hunt at night in open areas. So they're very open to the elements. They become very vulnerable if it rains. And very often when it's raining, it means they can't hunt. And if it rains for any extensive length of time, then they'll go days without hunting and they'll starve, and then there's a lot of mortality. But they have got the ability to switch to become daytime hunters. And in winter, you often see them out in the day. And so with that adaptation, it means that they can be more successful. They adapt their behaviour. They know their region very well, so they know where to go to find food. And as you often see, they perch as well, so they're not flying around wasting energy. They're perching, they're watching. So efficient hunter, adaptable, fantastic owl.
And top physiology.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling pretty chuffed, you know, as my dad would have said. Yeah, well, because for years and years we've talked about these combs, we've talked about the soft feathers, but we've never explained it before. So hats off to our researchers and, of course, to Ignacio and Josh for all the information you've given us. Now you finally know how it works, and it's down to fluid dynamics.